Russell City was a community that was on the west bank of what is now part of the city of Hayward, and it was on the western shore of the San Francisco Bay. And basically between the mid-19th century and the mid-20th century, it existed as a small town. Although it was never formally constituted as a municipality, it most definitely had a sense of identity in terms of being a destination point for people who were either migrating within the United States or immigrating to the United States. And of course, the first wave of that migration happened as a result of the gold rush. And Russell City, as it existed then, was quite attractive to people, for example, from Scandinavia, who saw in the wetlands a great deal of geographical resonance with their homeland. Russell City was, like a great deal of California in particular, multi-ethnic. And the ways in which it exhibited that diversity, if you will, was not only in the populations who lived there, but in the approaches that people took to the sustainment of their families, for example. So, well, let me digress for a moment to Carey McWilliams. Carey McWilliams was an important 20th century historian who especially focused on California. And he wrote in 1949 a book that today still holds true, which is called California, the Great Exception. And in it, he argued that California was dissimilar in its growth as rural communities from the rest of the United States. Whereas the rest of the United States found itself having very ethnically specific enclaves in the rural areas, let's say of the Midwest. California rural life was actually quite diverse. And so you would find Armenian farmers next to Italian grape growers, next to, I don't know who all else, I just kind of ran out of examples, but that you would see a variety of people coming together and sustaining and supporting each other. And so that same, even though that book was written in 1949, when I began looking at Russell City, it struck me that the same thing happened in Russell City, and that you saw this diversity of not just people of European descent, most notably Germans, Danes, Italians, Poles, but also African Americans, people from Mexico, people from Spain, and some Japanese Americans who found the land not only appealing to them because of its rurality, but the general embrace of one another. And so it is a very curious phenomenon that arose in Russell City, in that even though it was impoverished in the way that rural communities can be impoverished, people were very embracing of one another. And actually, if we were to interview people of that era, we would see, because I have interviewed them, that they felt that there was less of an emphasis on race and ethnicity than there is today. And so for a lot of the elders, people who are like in their 80s and 90s, even though they experienced racism, even though they experienced discrimination and hardship as a result of their ethnic and racial backgrounds, didn't express those experiences as resultant from living in Russell City and talk about one another. They talk about one another as being family. And it's so, it's such a positive response that when I've shown copies of the oral histories that I taped, people are disbelieving of that. And what they want to say instead was, oh, listen to the old people romanticize their lives back then. So that, I mean, so coming at it as a social scientist, I find that incredibly compelling, not because they're disbelieving, but more because what would engender that interpretation that people couldn't be happy and whole together. And what does that say about where we're at right now? So it's an ongoing story that's very interesting to me.